For advanced button styling, we're going to cover 5 different aspects: button alignment, transparent backgrounds, hover controls, button transitions, and box shadows. We'll start with alignment. As we know, when it comes to buttons that are pressed up against each other, adding margin to both sides creates breathing room. But this gets a little messy if we have sections that alternate alignment and justification. Whether we're using flexbox or text alignment or any combination of layout values, adding margin to both sides is always going to push off of things that are aligned to one side. And what we'll do is go to the Elements panel and drag in a div block. From there, we can move each of our existing buttons inside. And with our div block selected, we can name the class so we can style it and reuse it later. In our left aligned section, we'll go in and delete each of our old buttons. Then we can simply hold Option or Alt and drag our button block, which contains our buttons, right into the bottom section. Since the button block class is applied to both of these div blocks, we can simply go in and create a negative margin. And since we set the margin to 8 pixels on both sides of our buttons, we'll set the button block to negative 8 pixels on each side. 2 things. 1, the alignment on the centered buttons isn't visually affected. And 2, the buttons on the bottom are aligned perfectly. What if we select one of our buttons and increase the margin, let's say to 20 pixels? That's fine. Select the button block and adjust the margin to match, negative 20 pixels. That's alignment. Let's do transparent backgrounds. The size of the visible background by default is controlled by the text and our padding. We can add or remove padding to change that default size. But what we want to do here is make a number of fairly standard changes and animate those. We're starting with the background color. By controlling the opacity, we can drop all the way down to create a fully transparent background. When we add a border and we set the color to white here so we have contrast, we can more clearly define that boundary. And of course, setting a huge radius like 500 pixels gives us the capsule or pill shape. Or if we want only a gentle, subtle rounding, we can set it to something like 5 pixels. Now, like any design, we're not stuck with our existing values. Maybe we realize we want a bit more contrast now that the border is there. We just go into background color and play with the opacity a little bit until it looks right. And we can see that change right on the canvas. Now let's talk hover. Now, on hover, right now we get nothing whatsoever. It looks exactly the same. If we go over to states and select the hover state, we can set a completely different background color, bring up the opacity to full. And of course, now our white text against the white background is going to be a major issue for legibility, so we can set our font color too. On hover, we can see the change on the canvas. With a lot of hovers, sometimes the designer's element edges can get a bit distracting. We can turn those off right here. We can still select elements on the page, but hovering will let us preview the effect without showing the element edges. What about movement? In our hover state, we can go down to transforms and move the element in any direction. X, of course, moves left and right. Y moves us up and down. Let's choose something subtle here, negative 3 pixels. And now on hover, our buttons appear to move up 3 pixels. Let's smooth this out, because this is all a bit abrupt. With any of our buttons selected, we can go over and add transitions for each value we've set on hover. We'll add one for background color. But if we stop here, it's apparent that the background color smoothly fades, but everything else cuts abruptly. Let's add a second transition, this time going down to font color. And lastly, we can go in and set one more transition, this time choosing transform. Now, 3 pixels over 200 milliseconds looks fine, but we can extend that if we want, something like 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. Let's close out, and on hover, the transform effect smoothly transitions over a full second. And none of this is fixed as is. At this point, we can go in and really start tweaking the appearance of our buttons, affecting the padding, the typography values, from all caps to font size and font spacing. And we can go back in and see how the transition looks if we change the opacity, make our background even a little bit darker. And when we hover over our buttons on the canvas, it looks pretty good. But we can see that there's yet another opportunity to add contrast, and that's a box shadow. If we use the drop shadow preset, we have a good starting point and access to all our box shadow controls, like blur, distance. Let's do 5 pixels. And we can play with the angle until it's right. Let's choose straight down. And of course, we can make adjustments to the opacity on the shadow. And what happens on hover? Let's go to the hover state. And since we set a transform earlier to move up 3 pixels on hover, let's add 3 pixels of distance to that shadow to give it a lift. And we can increase the opacity of our shadow color to make it a bit more dramatic. Close out and head on over to preview, and we see our drop shadow in action. Since we've yet to add a transition for the box shadow, the shadow cuts abruptly on hover. We can go back over to transition and add one. Of course, we select the box shadow for our transition. Over in preview, we can see the box shadow is smoothly fading on hover. So if we're looking to align buttons in different environments, we can use a div block to wrap them, creating negative margin to offset the margin on buttons. We can adjust the opacity on our button backgrounds to create transparency. We can make a number of style adjustments in the hover state. We can add transitions for each value we want to smooth out. And we can add shadows, adding lift and dimension to our buttons.